The morning light of late September 1926 strikes the limestone facade at the corner of Fifth Avenue and West 57th Street with peculiar clarity, illuminating a structure already marked for erasure. The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, covering an entire city block from 57th to 58th Street along the avenue's western flank, rises in layered French Renaissance grandeur, rusticated base, paired pilasters, mansard roof punctuated by dormers and chimneys. Constructed between 1879 and 1883 by architect George B. Post, then dramatically expanded by Richard Morris Hunt in 1892-1894. The residence once contained 137 rooms and represented the largest private home ever built in Manhattan. Yet this morning, as workmen begin erecting scaffolding along the Fifth Avenue frontage, the architectural treatises and society columns that once praised its unrivaled magnificence have fallen silent. The wrecking permits have been issued. Within months, the limestone will be reduced to rubble, the gilded interiors dismantled and dispersed, leaving only photographs and memory where marble once proclaimed permanence. In the spring of 1879, when the first architectural drawings were laid before Cornelius Vanderbilt II at his desk in the New York Central Railroad offices downtown, the site at Fifth Avenue and 57th Street represented the northern frontier of Manhattan's fashionable district. Below 50th Street, brownstones and churches defined the avenue's character. Above, open lots and scattered residences marked the edge of settlement. Cornelius, eldest grandson of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, and heir to a railroad empire, valued at over $200 million, understood what his father, William Henry, had not fully grasped. That architecture in New York was warfare by other means, and that commanding this strategic corner would signal dynastic ambition more clearly than any ledger or stock certificate. The architect chosen for this campaign was George Brown Post, already established through his design of the Western Union Building and the Equitable Life Assurance Society headquarters. Post's preliminary sketches, preserved in the Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library at Columbia University, show a restrained Italianate palazzo, 3 stories over a raised basement, red brick with limestone trim, measuring approximately 100 feet along Fifth Avenue and 75 feet along 57th Street. The design followed conventions of the merchant prince, substantial but not overwhelming, assertive but not vulgar. Estate records from 1879 show the land purchase at $400,000, a significant sum, but hardly shocking for prime Manhattan real estate. Construction accounts from the George B. Post firm detail contracts for Ohio sandstone foundations, Philadelphia pressed brick, and interior woodwork from mills in Grand Rapids. The house was intended to accommodate Cornelius, his wife Alice Gwynn Vanderbilt, and their growing family, a domestic fortress at the threshold of Central Park. Yet, even as masons laid the first courses in 1880, the architectural calculus was shifting. 2 blocks south, William Kissam Vanderbilt, Cornelius's younger brother and keenest rival, had commissioned Richard Morris Hunt to design what newspapers would soon call a petit chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue, a flamboyant Loire Valley fantasy that would redefine mansion architecture in the city. When Hunt's design was revealed in 1878, with its soaring tower, carved limestone, and assertive French Renaissance vocabulary, it made George Post's Italianate box look suddenly provincial. Cornelius, a man of systematic habits and deep competitive instinct, understood the implications. One did not allow a younger brother to outbuild the family's senior line. The arms race had begun, though the weapons were dormers and balustrades rather than cannons. The house post, completed in 1882, was elegant but incomplete as a statement of supremacy. Photographs from 1883, held in the Museum of the City of New York archives, show a handsome red brick residence with limestone quoins and a modest cornice, comfortable, refined, but legible as a compromise between ambition and restraint. Inside, the principal rooms occupied the parlor floor, a drawing room facing Fifth Avenue, a dining room toward the rear, and a library paneled in oak. Alice Vanderbilt oversaw the interior decoration, importing French furniture and commissioning portrait paintings that established genealogical legitimacy through visual narrative. Yet the scale remained domestic. Reception accounts from society columns in 1883 and 1884 describe gatherings for 50 or 70 guests, substantial, but nowhere near the scale of the Astor's Ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue or the emerging grandeur of the William K. Vanderbilt Chateau. What architecture could not yet express, money was already accumulating the means to correct. The railroad dividends flowed with mechanical regularity. Cornelius's management of the New York Central proved both cautious and profitable. Estate account books show annual incomes exceeding $1 million by the mid-1880s, a sum that transformed the question from "can we afford expansion?" to "how large must we build to reflect our true position?" The death of William Henry Vanderbilt in 1885, leaving Cornelius and his brother William K. as principal heirs to an even vaster fortune, removed the last restraint of paternal conservatism. By 1890, the family's combined wealth exceeded that of any private entity in the Western Hemisphere. The house at 57th Street, still wearing Post's modest Italianate dress, had become inadequate to the fortune it sheltered. The decision to expand, rather than relocate, reflected both pragmatism and pride. Cornelius had already established the 57th Street corner as his seat. Moving would concede the field to his brother's Loire Chateau 6 blocks south. Instead, in 1892, he turned to the architect who had created that chateau. Richard Morris Hunt, the Dean of American Architecture and master of the Beaux-Arts tradition. Hunt, trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris during the 1840s and 1850s, had designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, the facade of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and a series of Newport cottages that redefined the scale of American domestic architecture. When Cornelius approached him in 1891, Hunt was at the apex of his career, commanding fees that reflected his cultural authority. His commission was simple in conception and staggering in execution: transform the existing house into the greatest private residence in America. Architectural drawings from the Hunt office, now held by the American Architectural Foundation, reveal the scope of the transformation. Hunt retained Post's original structure as the southern wing and grafted onto it a massive addition extending north along Fifth Avenue to 58th Street, effectively doubling the house's footprint and creating a unified French Renaissance palace that stretched an entire city block. The new design abandoned Post's red brick for Indiana limestone, carved and rusticated to create a base that seemed to grow from the bedrock itself. Above this foundation rose 3 full stories, topped by a steeply pitched mansard roof, pierced by ornate dormers and chimneys. The Fifth Avenue facade, now measuring over 200 feet, was articulated with projecting pavilions, balconies of wrought bronze, and deeply carved ornament that cast dramatic shadows across the stone. At the 58th Street corner, Hunt placed a grand porte-cochere, a covered carriage entrance flanked by paired columns and topped with an elaborate broken pediment, allowing guests to arrive sheltered from weather and public gaze. The construction contracts, filed with the New York City Department of Buildings in 1892, specify materials that read like an inventory of geological empire. Limestone from Indiana quarries, marble from Tennessee and Vermont, granite from Massachusetts, slate from Pennsylvania. Interior elements were sourced globally: carved oak paneling from England, marble mantels from Italy, bronze fittings from France, stained glass from the studio of John Lafarge. The structural frame employed the latest steel skeleton technology, allowing for larger windows and more open interior spaces than traditional masonry-bearing walls permitted. This was not merely a house, but a demonstration of industrial reach. Every material, a tributary flowing into the reservoir of Vanderbilt wealth. The expanded residence was designed to accommodate not just family, but spectacle. The new ground floor included a grand entrance hall, paved in marble and rising 2 stories to a coffered ceiling, with a monumental staircase ascending to the principal reception rooms on the 2nd floor. Here, Hunt created an enfilade of interconnected chambers: a drawing room, a salon, a ballroom measuring 50 by 60 feet with gilt detailing and crystal chandeliers, and a dining room capable of seating 60 beneath a carved oak ceiling. Newspaper accounts from the mansion's completion in 1894 describe the ballroom scale in terms usually reserved for public buildings: a space worthy of Versailles, transplanted to the New World. Floor plans published in architectural journals show the service infrastructure required to sustain this display: a kitchen complex in the basement, separate servant staircases, storage vaults, wine cellars, and a coal-fired heating plant capable of warming a 137 rooms through the Manhattan winter. The 3rd and 4th floors contained the family's private apartments, bedrooms for Cornelius and Alice, suites for their 7 children, and guest chambers for extended visits. Hunt designed these rooms with somewhat less ostentation than the public floors, but still with a level of finish that would have marked them as exceptional in any other context. Carved mantels, inlaid floors, silk wall coverings, and bathrooms fitted with the latest plumbing technology. Photographs from family albums, later donated to historical archives, show these spaces as comfortable rather than palatial. A reminder that even within this monument to wealth, domestic life retained pockets of relative intimacy. The question of cost was never publicly disclosed, but contemporary estimates in the New York Times and the Architectural Record place the total expenditure for the expansion between $3 million and $5 million, sums that would translate to over $100 million in early 21st century dollars. These figures encompass not just construction, but furnishing, decorating, and the purchase of additional adjoining lots to create service yards and a small formal garden on the 58th Street side. For Cornelius, the investment represented less than 5 years' income. For Hunt, it represented the culmination of his architectural philosophy that great houses should embody cultural aspiration, not mere shelter. When the completed mansion opened for its first grand reception in January 1894, an event attended by over 1,200 guests and covered extensively in society columns, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a comfortable merchant's house had become a limestone proclamation. Architecture critic Montgomery Schuyler, writing in The Architectural Record in 1894, described the building as the most ambitious private residence yet attempted in this city, and perhaps in the nation, a French palace transported whole to Fifth Avenue, where it sits with perfect assurance as if born to its commanding site. The article's tone mingles admiration for craftsmanship with faint unease at the scale of private display, a tension that would define critical reception of Gilded Age architecture for the next century. Yet the house's supremacy was secured. From the 57th Street corner, it anchored the northern terminus of Mansion Row. Its limestone bulk and carved ornament established the visual standard against which every subsequent Fifth Avenue residence would be judged. Within its walls, Cornelius and Alice would preside over a social machinery designed to consolidate power, alliance, and prestige. A machine built of marble and steel, but running on the invisible fuel of railroad dividends and social ambition. The house that emerged from Hunt's redesign was less a home than an operating system for social power, each room calibrated for specific ritual functions. The great entrance hall on the ground floor served as threshold and filter. Visitors arriving through the porte cochere stepped from carriage to marble pavement without exposure to street traffic or weather, passing between bronze-sheathed columns into a space designed to inspire awe before any greeting was exchanged. Contemporary descriptions emphasize the hall's height, rising 2 full stories to a coffered ceiling decorated with gold leaf and allegorical painting, and its acoustic properties, where voices echoed just enough to lend dignity, but not so much as to create confusion. Footmen stationed at doorways maintained silent surveillance, their livery color coordinated to the room's decor. The spatial choreography was deliberate. Ascending the grand staircase required visitors to turn their backs to the street and face inward, toward the domain of the family, a subtle assertion of whose domain they had entered. Alice Gwynne Vanderbilt understood this architecture as instrument. Born in 1845 to a Cincinnati family of moderate means but impeccable lineage, she had married Cornelius in 1867 when he was merely wealthy, not yet dynastic. By the 1890s, she had refined the art of the social season into systematic campaign. Monday receptions, Thursday dinners, seasonal balls, timed to coincide with opera premieres and charity galas. Her daily routine, reconstructed from correspondence and appointment books preserved at the New York Historical Society, shows military precision. Morning consultations with the housekeeper regarding menus and floral arrangements. Afternoon calls in a carriage that waited at the porte cochere. Evening receptions that began at 9 and concluded at midnight with mathematical regularity. The house provided the infrastructure, service passages that allowed servants to move invisibly between floors, speaking tubes connecting the upper floors to the kitchen, electric call buttons that summoned assistance without breaking the conversational spell of the drawing room. The ballroom on the second floor represented the operational heart of this social system. Measuring 50 by 60 feet and rising to a height of 20 feet, it could accommodate 400 guests for a ball or 200 for a seated dinner. Hunt had designed the space with acoustic and visual calculation. The ceiling's plaster detailing diffused sound evenly, preventing the muddy echo that plagued many large rooms. The placement of mirrors along the walls created sight lines that allowed Alice, positioned near the entrance, to monitor the entire gathering without turning her head. Crystal chandeliers, each weighing over 500 pounds and requiring a dedicated structural support concealed above the ceiling, provided brilliant illumination that made diamonds and décolletage sparkle while casting dramatic shadows that sculptured faces into aristocratic relief. Window treatments of heavy silk damask could be drawn to create intimacy or pulled back to reveal views of Fifth Avenue's evening traffic, depending on whether the event required introspection or display. Press accounts from the 1894 season describe these gatherings with ethnographic detail. The New York Times Society column from January 28, 1894, records an evening when the ballroom glowed like a jewel box. Every surface seemed touched with gilt or crystal. The assembled company, including the Astors, the Whitneys, and representatives of diplomatic legations, moved through the rooms with the practiced ease of courtiers in a palace they knew well. The article notes the orchestra positioned in a musician's gallery above the hall, the supper served at midnight in the dining room on china commissioned specifically for the house, and the carriages departing along 58th Street until 2 in the morning. Such events were not merely parties, but exhibitions of power. Each guest's presence signaling alliance, each detail of service demonstrating command of material and personnel. But power projection required maintenance, and the house's operating costs reflected this. Estate ledgers from 1895, reviewed by historians during the mansion's demolition and now archived at the New York Historical Society, show annual expenses approaching $100,000, roughly equivalent to $3 million in 2025 dollars. This sum covered a staff of 40 servants, including butler, housekeeper, lady's maid, footmen, cooks, scullery maids, laundresses, and grooms for the stable at the rear of the property. Coal for heating consumed tons per winter. Gas and later electric lighting required dedicated maintenance. The constant need for cut flowers, imported food, and wine created a supply chain that touched every continent. The house did not merely exist. It consumed constantly in order to maintain the illusion of effortless permanence. Cornelius himself remained somewhat detached from the social machinery. Business correspondence preserved in the Vanderbilt family papers shows his primary focus remained the New York Central Railroad and associated investments. He was a director of over 40 corporations by the mid-1890s and spent most daylight hours downtown in his office. Yet he understood the house's strategic value. In an era when corporate power lacked full legal legitimacy, and when public opinion could shift policy, social standing provided political insurance. A man who hosted judges, senators, and financiers in his ballroom was more difficult to regulate or prosecute than one who lacked such connections. The house was capital investment in social infrastructure, yielding returns in influence rather than dividends. The tension between architecture as domestic space and architecture as public monument was most acute in the family's private quarters on the upper floors. Here, away from the marble enfilade and the servants' constant presence, a different scale prevailed. Alice's bedroom suite, documented in photographs taken before the house's demolition, featured carved woodwork and silk wall coverings, but remained surprisingly intimate. Two connected rooms totaling perhaps 600 square feet, with a fireplace, writing desk, and windows overlooking the small garden on 58th Street. Cornelius's adjoining suite was similarly restrained, its masculine furnishings and darker wood paneling suggesting a retreat from display. These rooms remind us that the people who commissioned the palace were not themselves palace dwellers by temperament. They were merchants and managers who had hired Hunt to build an architectural argument, then found themselves living inside it. Their children, Cornelius III, William, Reginald, Alfred, Gertrude, Alice, and Gladys, grew up navigating this split between private and public architecture. Family correspondence reveals their ambivalence. Letters describe both pride in the house's magnificence and discomfort with its formality. Gertrude, later a sculptor and founder of the Whitney Museum, wrote in her diary in 1900, later published in excerpts, about the cold grandeur of the public rooms and her preference for the smaller, less formal houses the family maintained in Newport and the Adirondacks. The mansion represented success, but also confinement. Its rooms were stages requiring performance, its spaces shaped by expectations that allowed little spontaneity. By the turn of the century, the house had achieved its purpose. It anchored Fifth Avenue's Mansion District, set a standard for scale and opulence that few could match, and provided the stage on which the Vanderbilts enacted their claim to social authority. Yet architecture is a fragile vessel for ambition. The marble that seems eternal in one generation appears merely historical in the next, and the forces that erode monuments are not always visible in the limestone at the moment of its laying. The Edwardian years between 1901 and 1914 represented the mansion's operational zenith, a period when its social machinery ran with the precision Hunt had engineered and Alice had perfected. These were years of unquestioned Vanderbilt dominance. Cornelius served as chairman of the New York Central Board. Alice reigned as one of the city's acknowledged arbiters of social acceptability, and the house itself had become a landmark so familiar that guidebooks listed it among the city's must-see sites, though tourists could only glimpse the exterior. Architectural journals published measured drawings of its facade. Art magazines reproduced photographs of the ballroom and principal salons. Society columns reported its gatherings with the regularity of tide tables. The house had transcended private ownership to become a public symbol, the embodiment of American wealth successfully translated into cultural legitimacy. This cultural work required constant maintenance. Each season brought a predictable cycle: autumn opening with redecorating and staff reassembly after summer dispersal; winter social calendar, culminating in January and February balls; spring tapering with preparations for departure to Newport or Europe; summer closure with furniture under sheets and only a skeleton staff remaining. Estate records from this period show the house rarely sat empty. Even during summer, maintenance crews repaired plasterwork, cleaned chandeliers, and addressed the inevitable wear from 8 months of intensive use. The mansion was not just a stage, but a mechanism requiring regular tuning to maintain its performance capacity. The technological infrastructure evolved with the age. Electric lighting, initially limited to public rooms in the 1894 completion, gradually replaced gas fixtures throughout the house by 1905. Telephone service extended into multiple rooms, creating a communication web that linked the mansion to the downtown offices, the Newport Villa, and the network of suppliers and service providers the household required. Elevators, initially hydraulic, later electric, moved between floors, reducing the physical burden on servants and allowing elderly guests to access the second-floor reception rooms without navigating the grand staircase. Each innovation was reported in the press as evidence of modernity, though all merely served to make the palace's operation more efficient, not to question its fundamental model. Yet even at its zenith, contradictory forces were gathering. The progressive era brought new scrutiny to concentrated wealth. Political movements questioned whether private fortunes of the Vanderbilt scale served public good or constituted extractive monopoly. Journalists like Ida Tarbell and Lincoln Steffens examined railroad practices. Regulatory agencies investigated freight rates and corporate governance. The mansion's opulence, once celebrated as evidence of American achievement, began to attract a different kind of attention. A cartoon in Puck magazine from 1905 depicted the Fifth Avenue mansions as medieval castles, with railroad workers laboring below, while banquet lights blazed above, the visual metaphor unmistakable. Architecture that had been built as assertion of legitimacy was being reread as evidence of excess. Cornelius died in 1899 at the age of 55, a relatively young death attributed to overwork and the strain of managing a railroad empire under increasing public and regulatory pressure. His funeral, held in the mansion's grand entrance hall, drew hundreds of mourners and was described in the New York Times as a scene of somber magnificence, the hall draped in black, the coffin surrounded by palms and white roses, and the assembled company representing the highest circles of American business and society. The architecture that had been built to project life now framed death, its marble surfaces reflecting candlelight and the faces of those calculating how the empire would be divided. Alice, as widow and executor, inherited the house along with an income structured to maintain her position. Estate documents show an annual allowance of $200,000, ample for operation, but requiring continued management. She would live in the mansion for another 2 decades, gradually shifting its purpose from active social command center to memorial of a vanished age. The balls continued, but with diminishing frequency. The dinners became smaller and more selective. The house slowly transitioned from theater to museum, even while still inhabited. Photographs from the 1910s, preserved in family albums, show the ballroom largely unchanged, but somehow quieter. The same gilt surfaces, but fewer candles burning, fewer guests reflected in the mirrors. The First World War accelerated cultural shifts that had been building for years. Suddenly, French chateaux were battlefields rather than architectural models. European aristocracy faced destruction or irrelevance. Conspicuous consumption came to seem unpatriotic amid calls for wartime sacrifice. Alice contributed to relief efforts and hosted fundraising events in the ballroom, but the context had shifted. A mansion built to proclaim permanence found itself an artifact of a world already receding into the past. Younger members of the family, influenced by modernist aesthetics and progressive politics, questioned whether such houses represented achievement or albatross. Gertrude, now established as a sculptor, moved in bohemian circles that viewed Fifth Avenue formality as stultifying. Reginald's gambling and social missteps became tabloid fodder, the family name associated with scandal rather than dignity. The architecture could not adapt. It stood as designed, frozen in Hunt's 1890s vision, while the culture around it transformed. By 1918, when the armistice was signed, the mansion had become an anomaly. Fifth Avenue itself was changing. Commercial development pushed northward. Clubs and hotels replaced residences south of 59th Street, and the automobile altered how people moved through the city. The house's design assumed horse-drawn carriages entering through the porte cochere. Motor cars created new patterns of arrival and departure that the architecture accommodated awkwardly. More fundamentally, the social system the house embodied, a world of rigid hierarchies, formal seasons, and assured deference, had been eroded by war, income tax, and democratic leveling. One could still inhabit the mansion, but its rooms now felt like period sets for a play no longer in repertoire. The 1920s brought the contradictions into sharp relief. Manhattan was booming, skyscrapers rising downtown, jazz clubs flourishing, fortunes made in stock speculation. But the mode of wealth display, had shifted from palatial architecture to penthouses, yachts, and conspicuous mobility. The house at 57th Street, with its carved limestone and mansard roof, began to read as Victorian rather than modern, a relic of an age that now seemed quaint rather than authoritative. Alice, in her 70s, maintained residence but with a reduced staff and increasingly rare social events. The ballroom, which had hosted glittering assemblies for 20 years, now sat empty most evenings, its chandeliers dark, its mirrors reflecting no one. Real estate economics told an increasingly urgent story. The land beneath the mansion, an entire city block on Fifth Avenue between 57th and 58th Streets, had become some of the most valuable in the world. Commercial developers eyed the site hungrily, calculating the rental income from an apartment tower or office building that could rise where the palace stood. Property tax assessments reflected this commercial potential. By 1924, the annual tax bill approached $250,000, a sum that made no economic sense for a single-family residence. Estate managers reviewing the Vanderbilt accounts understood the mathematics. Holding the house was hemorrhaging capital that could be invested more productively elsewhere. Architecture built to demonstrate permanence was being rendered obsolete by the same capitalist logic that had created the fortune to build it. Family dynamics compounded the financial pressure. Cornelius and Alice's children had dispersed, some to Newport, others to Long Island estates, still others abroad. None wished to assume the burden of maintaining the Fifth Avenue Palace. Gertrude had her own townhouse and studio in Greenwich Village. Alfred, who had inherited the family's railroad interests, maintained offices downtown, but lived in more modest quarters. The house had been designed for an extended family system that was already dissolving in the 1920s. The upper floor bedrooms sat unused, the servants' quarters were half empty, and the public rooms awaited gatherings that no longer occurred. Maintaining an empty palace for sentimental reasons made little sense when the property could be liquidated for millions. Architectural fashion had also shifted. The Beaux-Arts monumentality that Hunt had mastered now seemed overwrought to a generation influenced by Art Deco streamlining and modernist austerity. Younger architects dismissed French Renaissance revival as backward-looking pastiche. Progressive clients preferred the clean lines and functional expression championed by figures like Raymond Hood and Elie Jacques Kahn. The mansion's carved ornament and historicist vocabulary, once the height of architectural sophistication, now appeared fusty and retrograde. It was not that the house had deteriorated. Rather, the cultural framework that made sense of its aesthetic choices had collapsed. The palace stood intact, but the language needed to read it as triumph had been lost. Alice's death in 1934 would formally end the house's life as residence, but the decision to demolish predated her passing by nearly a decade. Estate records from 1925 show negotiations with real estate developers exploring the site's commercial potential. Multiple schemes were proposed: a luxury apartment tower, an office building, a hotel complex. Each analysis reached the same conclusion. The existing structure had no economic value. The land's worth resided entirely in its potential for redevelopment. The mansion's demolition was not an act of vandalism, but a rational response to market forces. In a city where land was the ultimate commodity, even palaces were temporary. The mechanics of dismantling began in late 1926, proceeding with a systematic precision that mirrored the construction process 3 decades earlier. demolition contracts filed with the city specified salvage priorities. Architectural elements of sufficient artistic or material value to warrant preservation and resale would be carefully removed. The remainder would be reduced to rubble and carted to landfills on Staten Island and Long Island. The firm of Genovese and Sons took the primary contract, bringing in teams of skilled craftsmen to extract Hunt's most elaborate work before the wrecking crews arrived with sledgehammers and dynamite. Photographs from the demolition, preserved in the Museum of the City of New York collections, document the inversion of creation. Where once masons laid stone with care, now workers pried it loose with crowbars. Where artisans had installed carved mantels and bronze fixtures, salvage crews now cataloged and crated them for auction. The process exposed the building's internal structure. Steel beams that had allowed Hunt to create large open spaces now stood naked as the walls fell away. Plaster ceilings that had concealed mechanical systems now revealed networks of pipes and wiring. The mansion, stripped of its finish, became an anatomy lesson in Gilded Age construction. Layers of material and technology that had been hidden beneath decorative surfaces. The salvage auctions attracted collectors, museums, and dealers in architectural antiques. Anderson Galleries in Manhattan conducted a major sale in 1927, offering carved wood paneling, marble mantels, bronze balustrades, stained glass windows, and even sections of the grand staircase. The auction catalog described each lot with the care once reserved for old master paintings. Lot 47, carved oak overmantel from the second-floor library, French Renaissance style, circa 1894, attributed to craftsmen working under the direction of Richard Morris Hunt. Prices varied wildly. Some elements sold for substantial sums to museums and wealthy collectors furnishing their own estates. Others fetched modest amounts from dealers who would resell them piecemeal. The house that had been a unified architectural statement was now disaggregated into portable fragments. Its coherence dissolved into inventory. Some elements found institutional homes. The Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired carved doorways and decorative panels, incorporating them into period room displays that would, ironically, preserve fragments of the mansion longer than the building itself survived. Several mantels went to Newport Estates, where they were installed in other Vanderbilt-built houses, creating a kind of architectural cannibalism, where one palace consumed the remains of another. The grand staircase, too large and complex to move as a unit, was disassembled into components. The bronze balustrades sold separately from the marble treads. The newel posts detached and auctioned as standalone sculptures. What had been an integrated experience of ascension became a collection of decorative objects, their original spatial relationships and architectural intentions obscured by their new contexts. Yet most of the house simply vanished. The limestone blocks, too generic to command collector interest, were broken up for fill material. The structural steel was cut and sold for scrap, its value measured by weight rather than architectural significance. Plaster and lath went to landfills. Flooring was torn up and discarded. Miles of electrical wiring and plumbing were stripped for copper and brass, then hauled away. By the spring of 1927, the site had been cleared to grade level. The foundations blasted apart and excavated, leaving only bare earth where Hunt's palace had stood. Photographs from May 1927 show an empty lot, fenced and leveled, awaiting new construction. The transformation took less than 8 months. A building that required over a decade to conceive and construct was erased in the time it took for one summer to pass. The architectural press received the demolition with ambivalence. The American Architect magazine published a brief obituary in March 1927, noting that the Vanderbilt mansion, long a landmark of Fifth Avenue's residential grandeur, has fallen to the demands of commerce. While one may lament the loss of so accomplished an example of French Renaissance design, the economic forces that drive the modern city are unyielding, and sentiment cannot preserve what financial logic condemns. The tone is elegiac but resigned, acknowledging that regret changes nothing. Other journals simply noted the demolition in passing, as if the disappearance of a 137-room palace were routine news, which in 1920s Manhattan it increasingly was. A small group of preservationists attempted to mount opposition, arguing that the mansion represented an irreplaceable work of American architecture and that some mechanism, perhaps purchased by a museum or conversion to institutional use, might save it. These efforts, documented in correspondence at the New York Historical Society, foundered on practical obstacles. No institution commanded resources sufficient to acquire and maintain the property. No legal framework existed to compel preservation against the owner's wishes. And the Vanderbilt heirs, while not hostile to preservation in principle, saw no reason to sacrifice millions in land value for sentimental or historical purposes. The preservationist arguments anticipated later preservation movements, but in 1926, they lacked the cultural authority and legal tools to achieve their goals. The house fell because nothing could prevent it. In the space where the mansion once stood, a new structure rose by 1929. Bergdorf Goodman's expanded department store, a 7-story commercial building designed by Buchmann and Kahn in a restrained Art Deco style. The store occupied the entire block, its limestone facade echoing, perhaps ironically, the material of the Vanderbilt Palace it replaced. Contemporary accounts praised the store's modern efficiency and elegant display windows, noting how perfectly it suited the evolving character of Fifth Avenue. Within 2 years, no visible trace of the mansion remained. The sidewalks, the streetscape, even the rhythm of pedestrian traffic adjusted as if the palace had never existed. The city absorbed the change and moved forward, as cities do. The dispersal of the mansion's contents reveals how architectural meaning dissolves once spatial context is destroyed. Objects that had formed a coherent visual and cultural narrative inside Hunt's enfilade became, once removed, simply furniture and ornament. Beautiful perhaps, valuable certainly, but stripped of the relational logic that gave them architectural significance. A carved mantel installed in a suburban living room ceased to be a component of a 137-room palace and became merely a decorative fireplace surround. A bronze balustrade section mounted on a museum wall became sculpture rather than functional architecture. The house's meaning had resided not in individual elements, but in their assembly. The way the entrance hall led to the staircase, which led to the ballroom, which opened to the salon, creating a spatial sequence designed to shape experience and signal hierarchy. Once that sequence was broken, the parts retained beauty but lost their syntax. Some salvaged elements traveled extraordinary distances. Auction records trace a carved limestone doorway to a Los Angeles estate where it was installed as the entrance to a library. The doorway's original function within the Vanderbilt mansion was forgotten, its new owners valuing it simply as genuine French Renaissance stonework, circa 1890s. Several mantels migrated to estates in Palm Beach, where they were incorporated into Mediterranean revival houses that bore no stylistic relationship to Hunt's Beaux-Arts vision. The stained glass windows, produced by Louis Comfort Tiffany and John Lafarge, were divided among several buyers. Some went to churches, seeking to enhance their sanctuaries with prestigious provenance. Others to collectors who framed them as freestanding art. In each case, transplantation meant transformation. Objects designed as part of an architectural totality became autonomous artifacts, their meaning shifting from contextual to intrinsic. The most complete preservation occurred not through physical salvage, but through documentation. The Historic American Buildings Survey, established in 1933 as a Depression-era employment program for architects, included measured drawings and photographs of significant American buildings, though the survey began too late to document the Vanderbilt mansion before its demolition. However, Richard Morris Hunt's office archives, deposited at the American Architectural Foundation, preserved original construction drawings, elevations, and floor plans. These documents, rendered in precise ink on linen, show the mansion as Hunt intended it. Every cornice detail, every room dimension, every material specification recorded with professional clarity. Architectural historians studying these drawings can reconstruct the building's spatial logic even without visiting the site, though such reconstruction remains abstract, lacking the sensory dimensions, light quality, acoustic character, material texture, that only physical presence provides. Photographs, too, serve as archives. Family albums, press photographs, and images from architectural journals capture the mansion's interiors and exteriors across its 34-year lifespan. These images, collected in museum archives and private collections, reveal details invisible in drawings. How afternoon light struck the ballroom's chandeliers, how flowers arranged on mantels provided color contrast against carved stone, how the placement of furniture created conversational groupings within vast rooms. Yet photographs also deceive, flattening three-dimensional space into two-dimensional representation, and imposing the photographer's perspective as authoritative. The mansion exists now primarily in these images, and our understanding of it is shaped by what photographers chose to document and what they ignored or couldn't capture. A curious episode underscores the slippage between architectural reality and cultural memory. In the 1940s, a Hollywood production designer seeking reference material for a film set in the Gilded Age requested photographs of the greatest Fifth Avenue mansion. Museum archivists, uncertain which house best fit that description, sent images of both the demolished Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion and the surviving William K. Vanderbilt Chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue. The designer, unable to distinguish between them and unaware that one no longer existed, incorporated elements from both into the film sets, creating a hybrid that represented neither mansion accurately. This cinematic composite, seen by millions of filmgoers, became for many their mental image of Gilded Age luxury, demonstrating how demolished buildings live on through imperfect copies and reimagined reconstructions that may bear little relationship to the original. The question of what constitutes preservation grows complex when applied to demolished structures. Is a building preserved if its floor plans survive in archives? If its decorative elements are scattered across museums? If photographs allow detailed study of its appearance? Or does preservation require the physical structure itself in its original location, experienced as its architects and owners intended? These questions, largely theoretical in the 1920s, became urgent by mid-century as preservation movements gained strength and as architectural historians recognize that buildings, once demolished, leave only fragmented traces that can never fully reconstitute their original presence and meaning. The site's transformation into commercial space completed a process that had been inevitable since Manhattan's economic logic outgrew its architectural fantasies. The Bergdorf Goodman store that rose on the Vanderbilt lot in 1928-1929 was designed by the firm of Buchmann and Kahn, architects who understood Fifth Avenue's emerging character as luxury retail corridor rather than residential boulevard. Their seven-story limestone structure, restrained in ornament and modern in its display window technology, represented efficiency where the Vanderbilt Palace had represented display. The store's interior, organized around escalators and open floor plans that maximized merchandise visibility, inverted the mansion's spatial logic. Where Hunt had created sequences of enclosed hierarchical rooms designed to control and choreograph movement, Bergdorf's architects created fluid, democratic space designed for browsing and impulse purchase. The irony was noted by contemporary observers. A column in The New Yorker from 1929, written just after the store's opening, remarked that where once the Vanderbilts received in marble halls, now the daughters of shopkeepers purchase stockings and perfume. The democracy of commerce has achieved what politics never could: the conversion of private palace into public bazaar, aristocratic space into mercantile venue. The tone is wry, but not hostile. By the late 1920s, the Gilded Age had receded sufficiently into the past that its mansions could be viewed as historical curiosities rather than living threats to egalitarian values. The store's success, drawing tens of thousands of customers weekly, confirmed that Fifth Avenue's future lay in retail, not residence. Other Fifth Avenue mansions followed the Vanderbilt house into demolition with increasing rapidity. The 1920s and 1930s saw a cascade of palace removals. The William K. Vanderbilt Chateau at 665th Avenue fell in 1926, just months before the Cornelius II mansion. The William Astor House at 355th Avenue was demolished in 1926. The Benjamin Duke residence gave way to a commercial building in 1927. Each demolition was reported in the press, but with diminishing surprise. What had seemed shocking in 1926 became routine by 1930. Architectural preservationists watched helplessly as an entire streetscape vanished, its architectural coherence destroyed piecemeal as individual owners made separate decisions driven by identical economic logic. The Fifth Avenue of brownstones and palaces, the avenue photographed and celebrated in books and magazines for half a century, disappeared in less than a decade, replaced by an avenue of shops, hotels, and apartment towers. Historians later analyzed this transformation as a case study in urban capitalism's treatment of architecture. The mansions represented capital frozen in non-productive form. Beautiful, impressive, but generating no income, and in fact, consuming resources for maintenance and taxes. Once the social system that justified this capital allocation weakened, once inherited status no longer commanded sufficient deference to outweigh economic inefficiency, the buildings became vulnerable. They fell not because they were ugly or structurally unsound, but because they occupied land whose highest economic use was commercial, and no legal or cultural mechanism existed to prioritize historical or aesthetic value over market value. The pattern would repeat across American cities. Wherever rising land values made residential architecture economically obsolete, Demolition followed, regardless of architectural quality or historical significance. The Vanderbilt family's response to the mansion's demolition was muted. No family member made a public statement mourning its loss. No attempt was made to preserve it through donation or creative reuse. The decision to sell was presented in estate documents as simple financial management, devoid of sentiment or regret. This silence is revealing. The house had served its purpose. It established social legitimacy, provided a venue for alliance building, and symbolized the family's position for a generation. Once that generation passed and the social system it inhabited dissolved, the mansion became simply an asset to be liquidated. The Vanderbilts, having risen through aggressive capitalism, applied the same unsentimental logic to their own architectural legacy. Yet fragments persisted in memory and anecdote. Elderly New Yorkers in the 1950s and 1960s recalled attending balls at the Vanderbilt mansion, their memories sharpened by the building's absence. These reminiscences, collected by oral historians and preserved in archives, describe the house with a nostalgic glow that may or may not correspond to historical reality. "You felt like a queen just walking through those doors," one woman recalled in a 1963 interview. "The ballroom was like something from a fairy tale, all gold and crystal." Such memories are valuable as evidence of the house's cultural impact, though their accuracy is inevitably shaped by time and the peculiar distortions nostalgia imposes. The palace grows grander in memory than it was in limestone, its social exclusions forgotten, its architectural and economic contradictions smoothed away by the passage of decades. The legacy of the Vanderbilt mansion extends beyond its physical existence or its salvaged fragments into the realm of preservation policy and architectural historiography. The house's demolition in 1926 to 1927 occurred at a moment when American attitudes toward historic preservation were in flux. Earlier, preservation efforts had focused primarily on sites associated with the Revolutionary War or other foundational national narratives. Places like Independence Hall or Mount Vernon, where patriotic value justified protection. The idea that recent architecture, buildings from the Gilded Age, less than 50 years old, might warrant preservation was novel and controversial. The Vanderbilt mansion's demolition helped catalyze a shift in preservation thinking, though not in time to save the building itself. Architectural historians writing in the 1930s and 1940s began to reevaluate Beaux-Arts architecture, which had been dismissed by modernist critics as historicist pastiche lacking authentic expression. Scholars like Fisk Kimball and Henry Russell Hitchcock published studies arguing that buildings like the Vanderbilt mansion represented significant achievements in spatial composition, decorative integration, and technical virtuosity, even if their stylistic vocabulary was borrowed from French Renaissance models. These reappraisals came too late for the demolished Fifth Avenue palaces, but they helped establish a framework for preserving later Beaux-Arts buildings, including several Richard Morris Hunt designs that survived, such as the Breakers in Newport and the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina. The formation of preservation organizations in the mid-20th century reflected lessons learned from losses like the Vanderbilt Mansion. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, chartered by Congress in 1949, and local organizations like the Municipal Art Society in New York developed legal and advocacy tools to prevent demolition of historically significant buildings. Landmark designation laws, first enacted in New York in 1965 following the demolition of Pennsylvania Station, created mechanisms to compel preservation even against owner opposition, a power that did not exist in 1926. These tools arrived too late to save the Gilded Age palaces, but they prevented later losses and established the principle that architectural significance could override economic calculus, at least in certain circumstances. The irony is that the Vanderbilt mansion's disappearance may have contributed more to preservation philosophy than its survival would have. Had the house remained standing, it would have been one among many Gilded Age monuments. Interesting, but not uniquely instructive. Its demolition, by contrast, became a case study in architectural vulnerability, cited in preservation advocacy and scholarship as evidence of what is lost when economic forces operate unchecked by historical consciousness. The house serves the preservation cause more effectively as absence than it might have as presence, a cautionary tale rather than a tourist attraction. Scholarly, attention to the mansion increased as primary sources became available through archive donations and research access. Architectural historians gained access to Hunt's office papers in the 1960s, allowing detailed study of the design process, material selections, and client-architect interactions. Art historians analyzed the decorative program, tracing the sources of carved ornament and identifying the craftsmen who executed specific elements. Social historians examined estate records, correspondence, and society columns to reconstruct how the house functioned as social infrastructure. This scholarship revealed the mansion's complexity. It was not simply a large house, but a carefully orchestrated architectural system designed to produce specific social and cultural effects. Academic publications in journals like the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians and books on Gilded Age architecture ensured the mansion remained part of scholarly discourse, even as physical traces continued to disperse. Digital technology in recent decades has enabled new forms of architectural preservation and recovery. In the early 21st century, scholars used computer modeling software to create three-dimensional digital reconstructions of the mansion based on Hunt's drawings, historical photographs, and site surveys. These models, while necessarily speculative in some details, allow virtual navigation through spaces that no longer exist physically. One can walk through the entrance hall, ascend the grand staircase, and enter the ballroom, experiencing spatial sequences that have been impossible to traverse since 1927. The models are not the building, but they preserve dimensional and relational information that photographs alone cannot convey. Museums have incorporated these reconstructions into exhibitions, allowing contemporary audiences to experience demolished architecture in ways earlier generations could not. The site where the Vanderbilt mansion once stood retains almost no visible trace of its history. The Bergdorf Goodman store, expanded multiple times since its original 1929 construction, occupies the full block from 57th to 58th Street along Fifth Avenue. The building's current facade, renovated in subsequent decades, bears no relationship to Hunt's limestone palace. Pedestrians passing the corner would have no reason to imagine that a 137-room mansion once occupied this space unless informed by historical marker or guidebook, neither of which exists. The urban fabric has healed over the wound of demolition, leaving no scar visible to casual observation. Yet historical traces persist for those who seek them. The block's dimensions, its unusual depth from Fifth Avenue to Madison Avenue, its precise frontage, were determined by the property lines Cornelius established in the 1870s and 1880s. Contemporary development, while erasing the mansion architecturally, follows boundaries the Vanderbilts created. In this indirect sense, the estate's spatial footprint survives, though unmarked and unrecognized. Property records and tax maps preserve the lot's history, showing transfers from the Vanderbilt family to commercial developers, though such documents are accessible only to researchers willing to navigate municipal archives. Salvaged architectural elements offer another form of persistence, though scattered and decontextualized. Museums, holding fragments, occasionally mount exhibitions examining Gilded Age architecture, displaying mantels or decorative panels alongside photographs and drawings to suggest the mansion's original grandeur. The Metropolitan Museum of Art's American Wing includes period rooms incorporating elements from multiple demolished Fifth Avenue houses, creating composite spaces that represent an era rather than specific buildings. Visitors viewing a carved doorway or marble fireplace in such settings may not realize they are encountering pieces of the Vanderbilt mansion, as labels often identify elements by style and date rather than original provenance. The fragments exist in a kind of architectural limbo, preserved but anonymous, their connection to the larger whole obscured by institutional display conventions. Private collectors, too, hold pieces of the mansion, though this diffusion makes comprehensive documentation nearly impossible. A limestone panel might reside in a Connecticut estate, its owners unaware of its Fifth Avenue origins. A bronze light fixture might have been resold multiple times through antique dealers, its provenance lost or deliberately obscured to enhance its perceived authenticity as French Renaissance rather than American imitation. The house exists in fragments scattered across private and public collections, but reassembling even a catalog of these pieces would require detective work across decades of auction records, estate inventories, and dealer transactions. No institution has attempted such a project, and the dispersal continues. Elements are resold, moved to new locations, or are destroyed when their current owners renovate or die. Photographic archives provide the most accessible form of preservation. The Museum of the City of New York, the New York Historical Society, the Avery Library at Columbia, and the Library of Congress all hold photographs documenting the mansion at various stages of its existence and demolition. These images, many digitized and accessible online, allow researchers and curious individuals to study the building's appearance in detail. Exterior views showing its relationship to neighboring structures, interior photographs capturing decorative programs and spatial sequences, demolition images revealing construction techniques and material layers. Yet photographs are selective. They show what photographers chose to record and what reproduction technologies could capture. Many rooms were never photographed. Some images are too poor in quality to reveal detail. Others are so staged and formal that they obscure how spaces were actually used. The photographic archive is extensive but incomplete, preserving certain aspects of the mansion while leaving others permanently obscure. The mansion's most enduring preservation may be conceptual rather than physical. As a case study in American architectural history, Gilded Age social patterns, and urban development forces, the house continues to live in scholarship, exhibition, and education. Architecture students study Hunt's design strategies. Urban historians analyze the mansion's role in Fifth Avenue's transformation. Cultural critics examine what its construction and demolition reveal about American attitudes toward wealth, class, and permanence. These scholarly uses keep the building present in discourse, though the building under discussion is increasingly abstract, a set of documented facts, recorded images, and analytical interpretations rather than a three-dimensional place one could visit, inhabit, or experience sensorially. The mansion becomes text, subject to readings and rereadings that may illuminate aspects its original inhabitants never consciously recognized. Other Gilded Age houses met different fates, providing comparative context that illuminate the Vanderbilt mansion's particular trajectory. The William K. Vanderbilt Chateau at 6th and 65th Avenue, demolished just months before the Cornelius II mansion, had its facade carefully documented by the architectural photographer Berenice Abbott in 1936, creating a visual record that captured its ghostly persistence in memory even after physical removal. The Astor Mansion at 350 Fifth Avenue became the site of the Empire State Building, perhaps the most celebrated case of a residential palace giving way to iconic commercial architecture. The contrast between these cases and the Vanderbilt Mansion is instructive, where the Astor site's transformation was memorialized in the Empire State Building's global fame, and where the William K. Chateau received documentary attention from Abbott, the Cornelius II mansion slipped into relative obscurity, replaced by retail space that, however commercially successful, carried no architectural distinction or cultural resonance. The mansion's disappearance was complete, its replacement anonymous. Yet some Gilded Age palaces survived, offering instructive contrasts. The Frick Mansion at East 70th Street, completed in 1914, was converted to a museum after Henry Clay Frick's death in 1919, preserved through institutional reuse that transformed private space into public cultural resource. The conversion required modifications, the addition of gallery spaces, climate control systems, and public amenities, but retained the building's essential character and allowed continued public access. The mansion's survival demonstrates that creative reuse could preserve Gilded Age architecture even when original residential purposes became obsolete. The Vanderbilt heirs, however, never considered museum conversion. The house had no art collection of sufficient significance to justify institutional preservation, and the family saw no advantage in maintaining it as memorial when commercial sale offered financial return. In Newport, several Vanderbilt-built houses survived because their locations on Bellevue Avenue became part of a historic district where tourism and preservation interests aligned. The Breakers, Cornelius II's Newport summer cottage, designed by Richard Morris Hunt in 1895, was donated to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948 and opened as a museum. Its survival reveals the role of location in architectural fate. Newport, lacking Manhattan's intense development pressure and land values, could preserve large estates economically unfeasible in an urban core. The Breakers provides contemporary visitors the closest available experience of how the Vanderbilts lived, though it too has been modified for museum purposes, with ropes, signage, and visitor flows that alter the spatial experience Hunt designed. The differential survival of Gilded Age architecture raises questions about preservation priorities and values. Why do we preserve some buildings and demolish others? The answers are rarely purely aesthetic or historical. Economic viability, location, availability of institutional sponsors, timing of preservation movements, and even accidents of advocacy attention all play roles. The Vanderbilt mansion might have survived Had demolition occurred a generation later, after landmark laws existed? Or had a museum expressed interest in acquisition? Or had the family chosen to donate rather than sell? Or had preservationists mobilized more effectively? The building's loss reflects not inevitable decline, but contingent decisions made by specific actors in particular circumstances, decisions that might plausibly have gone differently. Comparative analysis also reveals patterns in how demolished buildings are remembered versus how surviving buildings are understood. Surviving structures become tourist attractions, backdrops for films, venues for events. They accumulate new layers of meaning through continued use and reinterpretation. Demolished buildings, by contrast, become fixed in their moment of disappearance, frozen in historical photographs and scholarly descriptions that allow no evolution. The Vanderbilt Mansion remains forever, 1927. Its demolition, the last chapter of its story, whereas The Breakers continues to generate new narratives through contemporary experiences. Loss confers a kind of purity. The demolished building cannot be altered or misused, cannot accumulate inappropriate additions, or suffer insensitive restoration. But this purity is achieved through absence, a preservation of memory rather than material. The act of remembering a demolished building necessarily involves imagination, reconstruction from incomplete evidence, and projection of our own concerns onto historical structures. When contemporary observers consider the Vanderbilt Mansion, they confront gaps between what can be documented and what remains unknown. Floor plans show room dimensions, but not how spaces felt to inhabit. Photographs capture surfaces, but not sounds, smells, temperatures. Account books list expenditures, but not the labor conditions of those who built and maintained the house. Any narrative about the mansion must acknowledge these absences, must resist the temptation to fill gaps with speculation presented as fact. The current wave of scholarly and popular interest in Gilded Age architecture reflects contemporary concerns as much as historical curiosity. Books, documentaries, and museum exhibitions examining the era's mansions often frame them as cautionary tales about inequality, environmental excess, and the limits of individual consumption. Themes resonant in an era of renewed attention to wealth concentration and class divisions. The Vanderbilt Mansion becomes, in these readings, evidence of a system where railroad monopolies and exploitative labor practices generated fortunes squandered on architectural vanity. Such interpretations carry moral weight, but risk simplifying complex historical circumstances, reducing architecture to mere symptom of economic relations rather than examining it as cultural production with its own logics and achievements. A more nuanced approach recognizes multiple truths simultaneously. The mansion was both a remarkable achievement of design and craftsmanship, and a monument to extreme inequality. It served legitimate functions for the family while also reinforcing unjust social hierarchies. Its beauty was real, even if its social context was problematic. Its demolition represented both practical response to changing circumstances and tragic loss of irreplaceable architecture. History accommodates contradiction. Architecture embodies it. The Vanderbilt Mansion can be studied as artistic success and social failure, as technological innovation and moral excess, without resolving these tensions into simplistic judgment. The question of what buildings deserve preservation continues to evolve. Mid-20th century preservation focused primarily on structures associated with famous individuals, significant historical events, or exceptional artistic merit. More recent approaches consider vernacular architecture, structures representing underrepresented communities, and buildings significant for social history, even if aesthetically modest. These expanded criteria complicate rather than simplify preservation decisions. If more types of buildings warrant protection, how do communities allocate limited resources among competing priorities? The Vanderbilt Mansion's loss occurred in an era when such frameworks barely existed. Current preservation debates occur in a landscape shaped partly by reflection on losses, like the Vanderbilt House, and determination to prevent repetition. Digital preservation raises new questions about what constitutes architectural survival. If a three-dimensional computer model captures a building's spatial relationships and allows virtual navigation through its rooms, has the building been preserved? If photographic archives and scholarly publications maintain detailed knowledge of a structure's design, construction, and use, does physical absence matter? These questions lack clear answers. Most preservationists maintain that physical structures carry meanings and values, material authenticity, craft evidence, sensory experience, that representations cannot fully capture. Yet representations may preserve aspects of buildings that physical survival obscures. Original design intentions later altered by renovations, spatial experiences disrupted by museum conversion, social uses discontinued when residences become institutions. The demolished Vanderbilt Mansion exists now primarily as representation, and perhaps that form of existence, while imperfect, preserves certain truths about the building more faithfully than problematic survival might have done. The limestone that once formed the Vanderbilt Mansion now exists as scattered trace, fragments in museum collections, rubble in landfills, dust dispersed into the city's substrate. The site itself, occupied by structures layered over the original foundations, retains no conscious memory of the palace that preceded it. Shoppers entering Bergdorf Goodman pursue fashion and luxury, unaware that an earlier form of luxury once defined this very space. The Fifth Avenue sidewalk where carriages once paused beneath Hunt's porte cochere now carries pedestrians and delivery trucks. The air where chandeliers glittered now circulates through climate control systems, serving entirely different purposes. Manhattan has moved on, as cities must, replacing old densities with new, old meanings with new, old architectures with new. Yet absence generates its own form of presence. The mansion's disappearance from Fifth Avenue arguably makes it more powerful as idea than it was as building. The demolished house cannot decay, cannot be poorly maintained or inappropriately renovated, cannot disappoint. It exists in photographs at its moment of perfection, forever 1894, forever pristine. This frozen ideal exerts influence on contemporary architecture and design. Designers reference Gilded Age grandeur without grappling with the complexities and contradictions actual preservation would entail. The mansion has become symbol, freed from the constraints of material existence, available for endless reimagining and projection. For architectural historians and preservation advocates, the Vanderbilt Mansion serves as reminder of architecture's fundamental vulnerability. Buildings, however solid, exist in time and are subject to forces, economic, social, political, that have nothing to do with their aesthetic quality or historical significance. Great architecture can disappear as easily as mediocre. Preservation requires not just artistic merit, but favorable circumstances, institutional support, legal protection, and sometimes luck. The mansion's loss teaches that architectural heritage cannot be assumed permanent. It must be actively maintained through ongoing effort, advocacy, and occasionally struggle against powerful interests seeking sites for redevelopment. The story that began with Cornelius Vanderbilt's ambition to build supremacy in limestone concludes with recognition that all architecture is temporary. Monuments proclaim permanence, but time recognizes no such claims. The palace that seemed eternal in 1894 was rubble by 1927. The store that replaced it may itself be replaced by future development, driven by logics we cannot yet predict. What persists is not the physical structure, but the historical fact of its existence. The knowledge that here, on this corner, for 34 years, a palace stood, that thousands passed through its doors, that its rooms witnessed events both significant and mundane, that its architecture shaped experiences, expressed values, and embodied a particular moment in American cultural history. That knowledge, preserved in archives and scholarship, constitutes the mansion's truest survival. Not material, but memorial. Not limestone, but memory. Not present, but permanently past.